Thank you. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Stanford Science Policy Group workshop of the magical year of 2020. We are the Stanford Science Policy Group, which is a student organization that's mostly grad students, where we try to connect grad students with resources about how to engage and how to learn more about science policy. And I am the president of SSPG. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at SPG Stanford. And it's just so great to have all of you here. If you really enjoyed this workshop, which I definitely think you will, because Madison and Sierra have done a wonderful job putting together a really high quality workshop today, you can stay in touch with us. We have a general meeting on the 23rd of September at 5 p.m., followed by a social. So if you got this email, you'll probably get more information about that. We also have a Science Policy 101 workshop on October 6th at 4 p.m. So feel free to join that workshop as well. If you're interested in learning more, just send me a message in the chat and we can get you on the Stanford Science Policy listserv, on our Slack channel, and you can connect with us on social media too. So without any further ado, I want to introduce today's incredible speakers, Madison and Sierra, who've been working very hard to put together a really incredible workshop about communicating science on social media. So thank you so much, Madison and Sierra, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Callie. Just to reiterate a little bit of what Callie just said, thank you all so much for coming. Griffin is going to be handling any questions coming in. If you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function or drop it in the chat for everyone or send it directly to Griffin if you want your question to be private. And please keep yourselves muted when we are not doing group discussion activities. My name is Sierra and I use she, her pronouns. And I am a recent grad of Stanford's Environmental Communication Program. And I'm from Monterey, California. And I really love the ocean, system science, sustainability science, and related topics. And Madison?
So hello, everyone. My name is Madison. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a recent grad from Stanford's Earth Systems Environmental Communication MA, and then also the Earth Systems undergrad program with a focus on oceans, atmosphere, and climate. I am currently working full-time at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute as the Science Communication Fellow, so really interested in all things oral communication, social media, SciComm. That whole world is just really exciting, and there's a lot of cool developments happening there. So today we'll get to talk about some of those and hopefully how to sort of kickstart your social media science career. So let's just start with a quick poll using that same link from before. What are some of the first words that come to mind for you when you think of a scientist? So we'll give everybody a few seconds to just either text or use the web link there to submit some words for what comes to mind when you think of a scientist. Great, so a lot of good responses coming in. Objective, expert, intelligent, testing, learning, creative, resourceful. Yes, microscope, evidence. Let's see, objective and expert are getting even bigger.
Skeptical.
Skeptical.
I love that no one's
Understanding.
socially awkward. Yay for bashing stereotypes.
Critical, rigorous, technical, careful, discoverer. So lots of great words coming in here for what comes to mind when you think of a scientist. So we'll give you just a few more seconds to put some of those answers in. Great, so now what we'd like you to do is to go into the chat, the Zoom chat, and type and send the name of your favorite living scientist. So we'll give you a few seconds. I know there's so many to choose from. So pick your favorite living scientist and drop their name into the chat here. This is great. We've already got a few coming in. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, yes, definitely a relevant character. Recently, UC Berkeley, Princeton, and then of course, Griffin. Great, still got some coming in. So we'll give you a few more seconds to think about your favorite living scientist. So unfortunately, only 19% of Americans could actually name a living scientist in the way that y'all just did right now. And that should shock you a little bit because we're sort of ingrained in this field. We either are scientists ourselves or we are familiar with our mentors or other people in the field who are active scientists. And so for us, this is a pretty straightforward exercise. But for a lot of Americans, that's something really difficult to do, which is one of the reasons why communicating on social media about science is actually a really critical function, because it gives us a pathway to start to connect with those Americans and those people who may not have a really close connection and aren't really up to date on what's happening in science today, not up to date on things that have happened since what they read about in their middle school textbook. So today what we're going to try to do at this workshop is go through a few different sections, starting with why do we even do social media? What is it? We're going to talk about how to create some influence in the social media space. We'll walk through some tools and strategies for actually crafting social media SciComm. And then finally, we'll do an activity where you actually get to put some of this to the test, craft some tweets, since it sounds like a lot of you are interested in science Twitter. So let's start though with why do we do social media and what even is it?
And these are good questions. You all answered a couple questions about your own social media use when you signed up for this workshop. And just about everyone in the workshop does use some kind of social media, but not that many of you are using it for science communication right now. There are about half the people in this group using Twitter, and then it kind of trails off pretty dramatically after that. And it's not something that scientists have done for very long, frankly. So why use social media and why use it to communicate science instead of sharing cat videos like all of our parents might be doing right now? I think that these are good questions to actually ask you all. So I'm just gonna take the first three raised hands if anyone wants to come up with some ideas of why you would communicate on social media instead of at a conference or in your lab meetings or through your academic papers and all these other places where you already get to communicate your science to people. And Griffin, if you can just, I can't see the hands being raised right now, so if you could just tell me who the first three are. And we'll wait until at least 3 people have volunteered before we go.
Anna Hampson.
Hi, thanks. I think that social media could be a great platform for communicating science because your audience is totally different than your lab meeting or a conference that you're at. And your audience might be people that don't have access to the science that you have access to. So I think that makes it a great platform. That's why I'm here.
Thank you. Griffin, who were I'm sorry, for some reason my chat in the entire bottom panel is just blacked out on my screen.
Laura and Julie.
Hi. So another thing why communicating science over social media is important is thinking about why your science matters. So taking it from the research that you're doing and through communicating on social media, you can think about the kind of what for part of the science that can sometimes make the science stronger.
Fantastic. And who was the last one, Griffin?
Julie?
Hi. I also see it as relatively easy way to just reach a larger number of people. Like sometimes it tends like you just see like this one professor in his lab working on one thing, and they just keep citing each other basically for the next 50 years. And so I felt it's a nice way to like basically share your science with a larger number of people who might be interested in it. And yeah, a lot of people use social media, so it's easier to just reach a much larger number of people.
Those are all fantastic answers, and I would encourage everyone to kind of keep thinking critically about why we are going through all these aspects of the workshop as we go along, and we'll continue to ask people to participate as we go. So thank you all for that. Let's jump into a little more detail with how you influence some of those different aspects.
So this is a figure that people may be familiar with. It's the rhetorical triangle, and it's probably something you've seen in like your AP literature class in high school, but it's still relevant here. And some of you have already hit on some of these different points of the triangle. So who is your audience? Who are you actually trying to reach? Why are you trying to reach them? What does your science have to say about the world that makes it important to communicate? Who are you as the speaker? How are you positioned relative to your audience? And those 3 points of the triangle will help you hone your message, which is what is the actual content of that social media post going to be so that it has the maximum impact when it actually hits the airwaves.
And like a lot of you already acknowledged, you are already doing communication and science communication. But when we're thinking about communicating science, there's always going to be kind of a trade-off and a balance between something that is accurate and accessible. And there are some statements that are neither, and these aren't particularly useful or far spread. But if you make a statement that is really accessible for people to understand and is wrong, it might still gain traction versus the kind of statements that a lot of you might be used to making in your communication are in this box of being really accurate and maybe have a lot of rich detail and expertise, but is not super accessible for people outside your field. And so what we really are hoping to do in social media SciComm is to hit this area where what you're saying is accurate and accessible, and it's not being accurate without compromising how easy it is for people to understand, and you're not simplifying to the point of compromising your accuracy.
So one of the ways that we can think about SciComm in social media is to think about it from this perspective of influence. So how do I exert influence in the social media space? And one helpful way to think about this is that influence equals teach times reach. And the reason that this is helpful is because you can have a piece of social media that's got all the details, like Sierra said, it's accurate and it's accessible, it's got all those good things, but if it doesn't reach anybody, you still have zero influence. And the converse of that is that you can reach a lot of people and have a really popular social media account, but if the science isn't there, if the content isn't there, then you're also not going to exert a lot of influence, or you aren't going to hit one of those targets of the rhetorical triangle. You're not going to properly communicate your message. So let's start first by thinking about this teach element. And one of the helpful ways is to go back and look at ways that do not work for teaching. So back in the 1980s, social media or science communication people determined that there was this thing happening in the science communication space called the deficit model. And the deficit model essentially said that we have scientists, people with a lot of knowledge on this one side of the equation. And if we could just get our knowledge to the general public, they'll think the way we think, they'll do what we do, they'll feel what we feel. Essentially, there's a deficit of knowledge in the general public. And if we can fill that, that will be good science communication. But that was not a really good way to work, because there's all these different filters and frames that influence the way an audience receives your message. So we know that because of that, the deficit model is not effective. And those frames are not necessarily bad, but they're going to differ depending on your audience. So that can include things like emotions, the shared values within your community, the preconceptions that you have about science in general or a particular scientific concept, the way that you learn and absorb information. And as we've seen in the past few years, your political preference can influence the way that that message arrives in front of you and then how you interpret it. So for that reason, it's really important for us to think about who is my audience and what are those frames that might distort or filter my message on social media. And we saw this come up in the initial survey for this workshop even. If you're thinking, oh, I am a scientist and I'd really like to reach more people in the general public, you're probably not being specific enough. You are part of the general public in a certain context, right? If you're an engineer and somebody is trying to communicate to you from the biology field, you might be part of their general public. So don't confuse that term for meaning somebody who's just a non-specialist. So this is just a few of the audiences that might be lumped into the general public that you might be interested in reaching. So for example, in the research branch, you might be trying to communicate to people who are still scientists and understand how that professional process works, but they're in a different discipline. Or you might go to somebody on a totally different part of the spectrum who's a community member in a faith community. And for that reason, once you can identify these groups, you can then start to go through that practice of what are those frames that they have around them and how can I find the best pathway to them? So this is not an exhaustive list of audiences, but all of them could be included in that general public umbrella. And if you're having some trouble nailing down who your ideal audience is, it can be helpful to also come at it from this perspective of who are the stakeholders in the conversation. And by that, I mean, who are the people that either have something to gain or to lose by what you have to say about the science that you're doing. So that can be especially relevant if you're trying to reach industry professionals or fossil fuel companies or pharmaceutical companies. If that's your audience, appealing to what their stake in the conversation is can be one of those pathways in. So we're starting to nail down this teach element, but then how do we get the reach? How do we get the message out to people through this social media network? And most times it really comes down to optimizing for the algorithm. Social media is mostly software that's built up, and there's all these different lines of code that say this post should appear at the top of somebody's feed. So one of the most important things for you to do is just to understand how these different social media platforms work and how you can optimize your content so that it has a greater chance of getting in front of somebody's screen. There are a few things that are pretty universal for all social media that you can use. So tagging your collaborators, other people who have accounts on social media. This is something people do on Twitter all the time. If you publish a paper and just tag the other people working on the paper. Hashtags, so that's a way to sort of categorize your post and get it to an audience that doesn't follow you or anybody that you know. Eye-catching visuals and using multimedia, things that will make people stop in their tracks as they're sort of doom scrolling. And then also prompts for engagement. It's social media for a reason. So how do you create opportunities for people to interact with your content and interact with each other? But you can also get even more narrow and start to think about these individual platforms. So for example, on Twitter, what you're really looking for is they want to see you posting a lot and at high traffic times. If you want to get into the Twitter space, you really want to be posting a couple times a day and at these peak traffic times. And Twitter is pretty good about providing analytics for you to actually figure out what those times would be. For YouTube, you're going to want long videos. YouTube right now has actually changed their algorithm so that the longer a person is watching your content, the more they're going to push it, which is why you maybe started to see all your favorite YouTubers pushing out these like 45-minute to an hour-long sessions. They're optimizing for the YouTube algorithm. Facebook, shareability, interactivity. Instagram, you're going to want something that sort of breaks up that square, something that pops off the screen. LinkedIn, things that are very professional, development oriented. And then podcasting, you're looking for things like consistency in your release dates and having a regular schedule. With all of these things though, you're going to just want to keep in mind that the difference between screwing around in science is writing it down. So try to keep track of what you're actually doing and how might posting at different times of day or using different types of content change how you're doing. Things can go viral for unexpected reasons in the social media space, so you don't just have to be limited by what you see everybody else doing. So maybe at this point, if there are any questions coming up for people or discussion points, we can sort of take a breath for those. I don't see any coming up in the chat, but.
We're about halfway through right now.
Okay, so we'll keep on trucking through this here. And if you have questions, feel free to, again, either drop them in the chat or do a hand raise and Griffin will flag us down so we can answer those.
Real quick, Madison.
Yeah.
Adam's got a question about YouTube length. Adam, I'm gonna ask you to, yeah.
Hey. I'm actually a YouTuber. I just started.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mostly interested in introducing other scientists. I'll talk about my science, but I'm more interested in introducing people to other scientists and showing a bit of lifestyle. I heard that in some cases it's better to split longer videos into parts so that you get more view time, because like people get afraid when they see like a 15-minute versus a 10-minute video. I don't know what your perspective is on that one. If I should leave it at 20 or 30 minutes or.
Right, yeah. Right. It's interesting because this is a relatively new development in YouTube's algorithm. It's something in the last few years that they've changed up. And so this might be one of those cases where it takes a little bit of experimentation to just like see based on the numbers what works for you. And maybe that's a difference between something that's not science related versus science content, right? So I mean, if you're looking at Bon Appetit videos, maybe people are more willing to watch a longer, well, before the downfall of Bon Appetit, willing to watch a longer cooking video, but maybe not an interview. So maybe that's one of those differences between science, social media, and other social media.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Adam. Anything else before we keep moving along? Great. So now if we're starting to think about what are the actual tools and strategies that I can do to kickstart this and get it going, it's going to, again, be helpful for us to go back and interrogate some of these really basic terms to nail down what is it that we're trying to do. So these are the different modes of communication. You've got visual, linguistic, oral, spatial, gestural, and these are like the most basic ways that you communicate as a person to other people. So that's the first umbrella that you kind of need to nail down. And then what's the media that you want to use? Are you going to be using some form of video, radio, podcast, print, photography? These are the actual sort of tools that you use to craft that content. And then you can narrow down even more to what is the genre. So these are some of the genres that you might be familiar with in an academic setting. So a conference talk, a graphical abstract, poster presentations, a manuscript, a lab meeting. And what you'll notice is that you're probably presenting the same research in a lot of cases just through these different genres. But what makes them different is that there are different conventions and standardized ways of presenting this information. And the same thing is true on social media. So there's sort of a standardized formula for what a video abstract looks like, which, by the way, might be a really cool genre for some of you to think about trying. It's basically like a 2-minute mini video that's optimized for something like Twitter, where you can talk about your research from start to finish with some visuals and some oral communication. Really great way to quickly communicate your ideas. So you have to, again, go back to that triangle. What's my audience? What's my message? What am I good at doing? And how can I find the genre that best fits that?
And SciComm has to be accessible and inclusive to be good science communication. And so what I did just there by calling it SciComm is actually against what I would advise, even though that is probably not too hard of an acronym to figure out. But jargon and acronyms are really going to make people have a hard time, even if they're interested in the topic. Unfortunately, defining jargon doesn't really work that well either. There have been studies showing that people continue to just have less interest and motivation for continuing to read something, even if the jargon is defined up front. So it is better to use plain language. The language and the things you're sharing that might be really appropriate and great for Instagram might not work so well for Twitter, vice versa. It's good to be familiar with the genre, as Madison was saying, and this is completely serious. Aim for a 4th grade reading level on it when you're composing stuff for social media. It might feel like it's a little too simple, and you never want to feel like you're being condescending or dumbing down your research. That's not what you're doing. You're just trying to explain it in a way that's intuitive enough and interesting enough that people can get it without needing any background necessarily in the research. When you're doing a hashtag, it helps people read through the hashtag when you capitalize the first letter of each word. And when you are compiling maybe graphics or deciding what figures to share on social media, this actually has been a really widely shared resource. It's a screenshot from the Johns Hopkins Medicine website for COVID cases. And these were some states yesterday. And this is what the same graphic looks like with the most common form of red-green color blindness. And this is what it looks like with another common form of red-green color blindness. And so you can imagine that for the approximately 4 to 5% of people who are colorblind, it might make even if you have really interesting information in your graphics, it might make them pretty useless if you aren't paying attention to those kinds of details. And there are actually websites you can use that are free, that can give you a filter that makes your screen look like what it would, how it would appear if you were colorblind, and that can kind of help you think through whether or not they're good choices. When you're thinking about your science communication, it's also really important to consider whose voices you are amplifying on social media. When we asked everyone at the beginning to share their thoughts about scientists, it was really great to see a lot of objective and smart and exciting, but there are absolutely a lot of societal biases that go into what people think about who does science and what science looks like and how it works. And as an example of how powerful that is, about 50 years ago, when the experiment first started to be run on having children draw a scientist, I think 20 people out of 5,000 drew a woman in their drawings. And that has increased over up to in 2018, now about a quarter of kids will draw a woman, which is still not 50%, but it is a lot better. And so people really, as we established at the beginning, do not really know scientists, don't think of scientists very much in their daily lives. And so you all actually have a lot of power by your social media in what you're representing outwardly to the rest of the world as this is what science looks like and this is how it works. And that absolutely has an impact. On kind of a fun and related note is that social media can also just be a great chance for you to find opportunities and for you to network. It doesn't always have to be this pressure of, okay, I'm going to craft a perfect tweet that's going to be really engaging and informative and jargon-free all at once. You might be able to find academic opportunities or people to connect with or collaborations on Twitter. You might be able to just find people who are fans of your work and who make really sweet fan art. And when you're talking about your SciComm, you can tell it like a story, which is on to Madison.
Yeah, so this is how you might think about organizing a academic paper. So you're going to start with the basics, the introduction, what's been done before, what are the key terms you need to know, what did I actually plan to do. Your materials and methods will be different for each person's research. What are the results? You got to work through the graphs, the tables, the statistics, and then finally you get to what did we actually discover and where are we going next. But for social media and for really any good science communication, we kind of want to reorganize this whole thing and just put emphasis on different things. So for example, people want to know, like, what was the question? What did we find? And even better if you can provide some insight into how you got there, because I think for a lot of people, science is not thought about as a process, as a way of doing. And so this whole question mark in the middle is very mysterious to people. Like, what actually happens in that space? How do you collect data? How do you process data? How do you do things in the lab? And so if you can fill that niche and describe to people what goes on in that space, you'll be coming up with really novel content and content that actually increases the public's awareness of how science works. So these are just ways that if you're feeling intimidated by how do I actually come up with content, like that's great that social media is so good at reaching people, but like what am I supposed to actually write when I sit down to compose a tweet? Then you can just think about reorganizing your existing content and then doing things like take out the jargon, bring it down to that 4th grade reading level. And you can also ask yourself some probing questions that honestly will probably be beneficial to your research anyway. So what are the existing knowledge gaps in this area of research? What do we still want to know, or what do I want to know as a researcher that hasn't been talked about yet? What was surprising or challenging about the process? I mean, if you're working in field work, this can be a great opportunity to share photos of how you collect your data. And then if you're working in the lab, the same kind of thing. And this is also another good opportunity to think about this connection to policy, right? Because that's really what we're trying to do, is take research that is maybe fundamental in some aspects and bring it into the real world. So just by asking yourself those questions and then answering them, you'll be coming up with novel content.
So you have a story, you have some tips on how to make it work well, and you have a lot of things to think about now. And in order to start using some of it, I would suggest that you pick one thing, one platform or one metric on one platform, and just think, okay, my goal is going to be maybe I will tweet every day for 2 weeks, and I'm going to look at my followers and see how those increase over that period. Maybe your goal is I will try and find and follow 15 new science communication accounts that I am going to look at their engagements and kind of see what they're doing, right? And now you have different metrics available to you on different platforms. With Twitter, even if you just have a normal account, you can get really granular insight into how many people are interacting with your tweets. And interactions is really what engagements means. The different platforms have different ways that you can interact with material, but at the end of the day, if anyone does anything involving what you've posted, that's considered engagement. Followers are, of course, the number of people who are generally choosing to see what you're coming up with on a certain site. And impressions is, I believe, only used on Twitter, at least in terms of what you can see if you have just a regular personal account. And that is how many eyes went on your post, even if they didn't stop and click on it or comment on it or retweet it. Now, we're going to ask for a couple of raised hands again and think about, given all of this, what are some things that maybe we haven't come up with so far that you all would really look for in a successful post? And for successful, let's say we're thinking reach times teach. So if it's super viral and it is about drinking bleach, we're not going to call that a successful post. So Griffin, can you do the calling on people again? Thanks. We're going to wait until we have 3 hands raised at least, and then we're going to ask people for their thoughts.
Victor?
Hello. I mean, I'm not sure, but I guess I would look for something like, I don't know, a lot of comments and people, I guess, showing that they processed what was in the post.
Great. Yeah, commenting is a great way to tell if people are interested in what you're producing. Griffin, did other people raise their hands yet? I don't know why my toolbar at the bottom. Okay. Yeah, it's just not showing up.
Jesse just did. Go for it, Jesse.
Yeah, so going off of what Victor just said, looking at those comments, comments would show engagement, but you can also see if people were successful in actually understanding what you said based on what the comments are.
That is actually a really big advantage to communicating on social media, because if you do an interview with a journalist and they write up a paper and an article and it's published with something misleading, it's not very easy for you to directly push back against that. Compared with if you have a social media post that people are misinterpreting, or you haven't maybe explained it quite right, then you have a really easy chance to be in conversation with people instead of a one-way communication street.
Go on from Laura again. Go for it, Laura.
I think if you're trying to promote like a longer piece of writing, that looking at the number of people that interact with that piece of writing, so reading a longer blog post or something else that you might write, thinking through the people that learned something and decided to read more.
Great, I guess, I know I said 3, but I guess we'll just do the one last, unless, I guess we'll just do one more and then move on to our activity. Wait, Griffin, was there one more? I got a notification, but it might be from one of the people that already spoke.
Jessie still got her hand raised. So if you want to comment on anything else, maybe, or if not, that would be it.
No, sorry, I'm new to Zoom.
No worries.
Great. Well, Griffin is going to drop a link in the chat for an activity. And you are all going to be put into breakout rooms in just a moment. And with about two or three other people, you are going to get an abstract. And disclaimer, we have not vetted every one of these papers. You shouldn't assume that we chose them because they're the most impeccable research. We just picked some interesting topical papers from different fields, and you, together with your group, are going to be with, are going to read the abstract, and you're going to trim it down to just 100 words max. And you'll all have about 7 minutes to do this, and then we're going to give you instructions for the next step of the activity.
So don't leave the Zoom call, just click into this link that's been dropped in the chat. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here.